In this 4-part lecture series, we will talk about evolutionary genetics and mechanisms of evolutionary change other than natural selection. We'll conclude by talking about how natural selection has created a variation in the form of biocultural diversity in modern humans. Here's our summary slide for this short portion of the lecture series. Be sure to revisit this slide at the end of the presentation to make sure that you have retained all the information that you need to, and be aware that I provide a link to this slide in PDF form in the weekly to-do lists. Let's begin by talking about a mechanism of evolutionary change known as sexual selection, a force of change in nature identified by Darwin and thought of as his second great insight. You may not be familiar with the concept of sexual selection, which I'll define in a moment, but I'll bet that you could easily recognize its effects. For example, the mandrills pictured here are both members of the same species, but look radically different from one another. Which is the male and which is the female? How do you know? You may have seen mandrills before, as they were popularized by the Rafiki character in Lion King. But what about the drill, one of Africa's most endangered primates? Which of these drills is the male and which is the female? In the mandrill slide, if you quickly identified the blue and red-faced mandrill with the large teeth as the male and the smaller, more plain-looking individual on the right as female, you are correct. A similar pattern occurs in drills. The larger drill with the more showy facial characteristics was the male. Patterns like these are common in nature, with one of the most recognizable and distinctive examples being differences between male peacocks and female peahens. Why is it that male animals tend to have larger and sometimes more dramatic features and coloration? This is the result of sexual selection, which increases an individual's reproductive success. Because males and females are biologically different, they have distinct reproductive strategies and are therefore affected differently by sexual selection. If a trait provides an advantage in gaining access to mating opportunities, then it is subject to sexual selection. Be aware that it can be difficult to differentiate characteristics resulting from natural versus sexual selection, and that some traits are subject to both pressures. There are two ways in which sexual selection acts on organisms. The first is called intrasexual selection, which refers to competition among members of the same sex for access to mates. Typically, competition occurs between males. Intersexual selection is synonymous with mate choice, in which members of one sex, typically females, choose members of the opposite sex, typically males. Let's take a look at a few examples of sexual selection in nature. Your job will be to guess which of the forms or mechanisms described in this slide best fit the traits or behaviors shown in the following videos.
Male narwhals can weigh nearly 2 tons. With bodies up to 16 feet long. But it's their tusks that make them weird among whales. The tusk is actually a single gigantic tooth that can reach 10 feet in length. But why swing such a big sword? Scientists aren't exactly sure. Narwhals are an animal of misinformation and mystery, dating back to the Middle Ages when their tusks were fobbed off to royalty as unicorn horns. Is it used to impale their prey? No. Narwhals can dive more than a half a mile down to the ocean floor to feast on cod, squid, and cuttlefish. No stabbing or goring required. Is it used to poke around on that dark ocean floor? Possible, but improbable. Narwhals, like their dolphin cousins, use sonar to guide them through the depths. The tusk is jam-packed with nerve endings. Some scientists argue it acts as some kind of sensor. That would be one insightful incisor. But it's the males who predominantly sport the tusks. If the tusks had a survival advantage, the females would also be long in the tooth. Some scientists believe this means the tusk serves the same function as a deer's antlers or a teenager's hot rod, a way to show who's the fittest male around. Males occasionally cross swords. That's tickling the ivories. But whether it's a joust or a jaw session is anybody's guess. And the narwhals aren't telling.
The character of the forest changes as you descend, becoming ever darker and damper, favoring different kinds of animals and plants. Less than 2% of the sunlight reaches the floor, but even here there is extraordinary variety. In the great island of New Guinea, there are 42 different species of birds of paradise, each more bizarre than the last. This forest is so rich that nourishing food can be gathered very quickly. That leaves the male six-plumed bird of paradise with time to concentrate on other matters, like tidying up his display area. Everything must be spick and span. All is ready. Very impressive, but no one is watching. The superb bird of paradise calls to attract the female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
Male and only male gorillas have enlarged canines. Gorillas are vegetarians and are not hunters. They do not use canines as other hunters do, to attack prey and to puncture and tear meat. They do, however, eat tough plant materials, including tree bark and rotten wood. The size of male gorilla canines are likely the result of intrasexual selection much like the narwhal toothhorn. They are a form of communication to other males, a signal of male dominance and aggression. A classic example of sexual selection gone wild is the case of Irish elk antlers. While this extinct giant was actually neither Irish nor an elk, it did have huge antlers that measured 12 feet across in width and stood about 7 feet tall at the shoulder. The Irish elk was actually a massive species of deer whose fossil remains are found throughout the Northern Hemisphere and not just in Ireland. Researchers have identified two functions for the Irish elk's exaggerated antlers that both have to do with sexual selection. The first has to do with ritualized fights that modern male deer perform at mating season. While these fights rarely result in injuries, they are part of competition between males for access to groups of female deer. Large antlers also have a symbolic purpose. They function as a signal of the superior health of a male deer. Energy, in the form of high quality food, as well as bodily resources, are needed to protect massive antlers. Only the healthiest males could have grown large antlers, so antlers are actually a form of communication with females looking to choose the best possible DNA for their offspring. To give you a sense of the enormity of these antlers, here's a fossilized skull and antler rack recently accidentally hooked by fishermen in a deep lake in Ireland. Such traits are signals, and they can be behavioral or anatomic. Take the house finch, for example. Here we have a male and a female. The healthier a male house finch, the brighter his red feathers. Only finches with diets rich in nutrients from seeds and berries can produce such brilliant red plumage. So a male who is a skilled forager with a healthy immune system will be redder than his less fortunate friends. Behavior that appears to be bad for survival, but good for getting a lot of attention, is another form of signaling. Because humans are so cognitively and culturally complex, we do all kinds of signaling, not just to attract a mate. Interestingly, statistically speaking, biological or cisgender males are more likely to take the kinds of risks that can result in death than are women. A regional expert on snake bites at the Stanford Medical School once told me that men were more likely to be bitten by rattlesnakes on the hands and face versus women who were more likely to be bitten while accidentally stepping on a snake rather than trying to engage it in combat. Indeed, we don't have to look much further than the stars of The Tiger King and I for confirmation of this hypothesis about how sexual selection has shaped certain show off behaviors in human males. Evolutionary anthropologists have suggested that sexual selection in humans, at least in the early days, primarily acted upon males, who are on average 10% taller than females, but not as radically different from their female counterparts as other mammals. The rise of surgeries to enhance facial characteristics, often culturally perceived as being, quote, masculine, such as a defined and prominent lower jaw, are one indication that traits the general public might describe as manly conferred some sort of advantage to our ancestors in terms of mating. Some anthropologists argue that male strength and aggression were key to reproductive success for our ancestors, while others disagree. Let's now watch a talk from an evolutionary anthropologist who has studied sexual selection in humans.
Hi there. So I could be wrong, but I think this talk may have the distinction of being the one talk in this series that ends with orgasm. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Have you ever thought about the fact that you're here, you're alive on this planet because every one of your ancestors reproduced? Every one in an unbroken chain going all the way back to the first life on this planet over 3.5 billion years ago. That's a lot of reproducing. And for the past billion years, your ancestors reproduced sexually. So sex is a pretty big deal, but you probably knew that. Why? But let's talk about human mating. Why does human mating take the forms that it does? Why are we attracted to some people but not others? Why do we sometimes form long-term romantic relationships? Why do we sometimes cheat? And I don't mean why consciously do we do these things. And I don't mean what happens in the brain to cause them. I mean, why did we evolve these feelings and these behaviors? In other words, how did the underlying brain structures and brain chemistry contribute to our ancestors' reproductive success so that those traits got passed on into the present generation while others didn't? Now, answering evolutionary questions like this is a bit like being a crime scene investigator because we're left with the evidence and we have to try to establish what happened. So let's go back 6 or 7 million years ago to our early ancestors. This is right after the split between our lineage and the lineage that would eventually give rise to chimpanzees. Now, these were small-brained apes. They walked on 2 legs, and males probably fought each other for mating opportunities. We know this because males fight each other for mates in all of our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas. And because males tend to be larger than females when they fight each other for mates, and the fossil record indicates that our male ancestors were larger than females. So males tend to be larger, more muscular, stronger, more physically aggressive when they fight each other for mates. And our species has all the hallmarks of a species that's experienced an evolutionary history of male fighting for mates. For example, men have, on average, 60% more muscle mass and 75% more upper body muscle mass, and those differences in musculature translate into large sex differences in strength. The average man is stronger than 99.9% of women. These are data on hand strength, which is a good predictor of overall upper body strength, on over 600 men and women. And as you can see, there's a large sex difference, and in fact, not one of almost 400 women had as strong of a hand strength as the average man. So, men can open jars and move furniture, or at least 2 things that we're good for. Who cares, right? The answer is that men care. Men really, especially young men, seem really concerned about figuring out who's the toughest, who's the strongest, who's the most physically formidable, and sometimes they devise elaborate ways for determining this. From early in development, boys and men are more physically aggressive than girls and women all over the world, and this aggression sometimes results in violence. Men have a virtual monopoly on same-sex homicides. In other words, men are vastly more likely to kill each other than women are to kill each other. These are data from every society, from every time period in history for which data were available when the authors compiled them on the proportion of same-sex homicides that are male killing male. And as you can see, the percentage is always close to 100%. On average, 95% of same-sex homicides are committed by males. And importantly, these don't include war killings, which would bring the percentages even closer to 100%. And from what evidence that we have, dominance among men translates into mating and reproductive opportunities. So we're a species that's experienced an evolutionary history in which our male ancestors won mating opportunities through the use of force or threat of force. In that regard, our apple has not fallen far from the evolutionary tree. But in other ways, human mating and human reproduction are profoundly different from what we see in our close relatives, and they've changed a lot since our early ancestors. For example, males in chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas spend time and effort competing for mates, but they don't spend much time together with individual females, and they don't provide resources. They don't provide food for their offspring. So that's a big change. Although most human societies allow polygynous marriage, that is, one man married to more than one woman, even within polygynous societies, most marriages are monogamous. And in the average forager, the average hunter-gatherer society, almost 80% of married women are married monogamously. So that's a difference with other primates. And importantly, men invest in their mates and offspring. They provide resources for their mates and offspring. So how did we get there? Well, in species where males fight each other for mates, dominant males, indicated by the larger, darker male symbols here, tend to have more mating opportunities and hence leave more offspring. And subordinate males tend to have fewer mating opportunities. They're more likely to fail to reproduce, not to leave any offspring at all. So this sets up an interesting situation, because for subordinate males, it would actually be advantageous to attempt monogamy rather than attempting to win lots of mating opportunities. One mate is better than none. The problem is that, in general, subordinate males cannot defend females from dominant males, and besides, females tend to prefer mating with dominant males for the genetic benefits, producing stronger, healthier offspring. So what changed all of this was probably several transitions happening together around the same time. By about 2.5 million years ago, we had started to incorporate more meat into our diet. We know this from various lines of evidence, including, this is cool, stone tool cut marks on animal bones dated to 2.5 million years ago. That's cool. I love this stuff. And then by about 2 million years ago, brain size really started to increase, and with that became a lengthening of the juvenile period. So now kids became both really costly and costly for a long period of time. And this made male, you know that. This made male provisioning both possible and necessary. Possible because it's much easier to bring back calories, protein, fats in the form of meat than trying to do that by transporting plant foods. And necessary because kids became so energetically costly that individual females would have had trouble providing resources for themselves and their offspring. And actually, when we look at modern hunter-gatherer societies, that's exactly what we see. So these are aggregate data across several hunter-gatherer societies on net daily calories. Basically, are you bringing in more calories than you consume, bringing in through foraging, or are you consuming more than you bring in? And the green bars are net daily surplus, caloric surplus. In other words, bringing in more than you consume. And the red bars are the opposite, a deficit. So you're consuming more than you bring in. And you'll notice that men from about 20 years of age to 60 years of age are operating at a daily caloric surplus. They bring in, generally through hunting, more calories than they can consume, and these calories are distributed. If it's large game, it's generally distributed equally to everybody in the village or camp. If it's smaller items can be brought back to the individual family. But this contrasts with what's going on with women, which is when they're in their reproductive years, they're operating in a daily caloric deficit. Gestation, lactation, carrying babies are extremely costly energetically, and furthermore, they limit one's ability to forage efficiently. So male provisioning, both possible through hunting and necessary, and this change had profound impacts on human mating and reproduction. In a sense, it tipped the balance for females, so now it was sometimes worth mating with a subordinate male, even if he may not possess the best quality genes, if he provided resources. And this is baboon pornography. I'm sorry, I probably should have warned you there'd be monkey porn. This is from Play Baboon magazine. All right, I'm gonna stop with the jokes. This is a female baboon in estrus. Her genitals are swollen, and this happens in a lot of primate species. Females' appearance changes over the cycle so that they become more attractive, and this incites male competition for females during the fertile part of the cycle, with dominant males tending to monopolize copulations closer to ovulation. Well, we don't look like this, and you knew that. But what you might not know is that women's attractiveness actually does change over the cycle. My lab and other labs have shown that women's faces, voices, even odors are more attractive to men during the fertile part of the cycle. But these changes are extremely subtle. And compared to other primates, if anything, the evidence indicates that we've evolved to suppress cues to ovulation. That, in a sense, ovulation is concealed in humans. But think about what impact this would have. This would mean that dominant males would not be able to monopolize copulations near ovulation. In a sense, it would protect the pair bond from invasion by a dominant male, so that a male in a pair would have more confidence that he was the father of any resulting offspring. The couple is having sex throughout the cycle. And this is something unusual about human mating that we don't see in many other primates, but we have sex all throughout the cycle. And so this would essentially increase a male's confidence in paternity, because a dominant male or some other male wouldn't be able to target the female and bully his way in at the fertile point in the cycle. And this would have important implications for parental investment, in particular males providing resources for their offspring. Because across species, when males provide resources for offspring, they target those resources toward their own biological offspring, and they avoid investing in the offspring of unrelated males. And so the evolution of male care for offspring and investing in resources in offspring, pair bonding, and concealed ovulation went very much hand in hand over our evolution. We have also evolved a specialized psychology for forming long-term romantic relationships with the possibility of investing in offspring together. We fall in love. All around the world, people prefer mates who are kind and generous and capable and willing to care for mates and offspring. In one of the largest cross-cultural studies of human mate preferences ever conducted, covering 33 countries shown in red here, the single most important mate choice criterion to both men and women was mutual love and attraction. But as you also know, people are not always perfectly faithful to their mates. And in particular, women sometimes face a trade-off between good genes and investment. What I mean is women sometimes find themselves in relationships with men who may be caring providers, but may not possess the best quality genes for offspring in terms of making offspring strong and healthy. And several features of women's mating psychology seem to have evolved in part to resolve this trade-off. And I mean, sometimes recruiting genes, if you will, from outside of the long-term relationship. For example, women have more sexual fantasies about men other than their long-term partner during the fertile part of the cycle. And that's particularly true if the long-term partner has physical signs of being lower in genetic quality, like he's less physically attractive. I think that's interesting. And that's why I'm talking about it. I hope you do too. And women's mate preferences similarly change over the cycle so that they prefer more dominant, more masculine males during the fertile part of the cycle. These are results of a study that I conducted on women's preferences for men's voices. And I used computer software to manipulate recordings of men's voices to make them sound either more masculine or more dominant, or more subordinate, more feminine. And I had women rate them on how attractive would this man be for a short-term, purely sexual relationship? How attractive would he be for a long-term committed relationship? And I also got information about where women were in their cycles. Were they in the fertile part of the cycle or the non-fertile part of the cycle? These are all women not taking hormonal contraception. And what I found was that women preferred a more masculine, dominant sounding voice, specifically in the fertile point of the cycle, and only for a sexual relationship versus a long-term committed relationship. Now, this sounds like science fiction, but it's science fact, because this result has been shown lots of times across a variety of domains, from women's preferences for men's voices, that this result was replicated by another lab, women's preferences for men's faces, bodies, odors, and even behavior. Well, I said that we would get to orgasm, and we're there. I just want to start by saying I'm for it. I'm pro-orgasm. I think more people should have more orgasms. But from a scientific perspective, women's orgasm is especially fascinating because there's actually evidence that indicates that it increases the probability that conception will result from an act of sex. There's evidence that it brings sperm up through the female reproductive tract and toward the egg. And think about what the implications here could be. If women were more likely to have orgasms with some men than others, this could be a mechanism by which they choose, essentially not consciously, choose to be fertilized by some males and not others. And wouldn't you predict that women would be more likely to have orgasms with males of high genetic quality? And in fact, a study by my lab published just a couple of years ago found that women reported more orgasms and earlier timed orgasms. That is, they were easier to achieve, they achieved them more quickly when they were having sex, when their mate was more masculine and more dominant. And what's interesting is that this was true only for their orgasms from sexual intercourse, but not from other partnered sexual behaviors. I'll let you use your imagination, what those might be. So we've seen that thinking like an evolutionist can enable us to predict things about ourselves that we did not already know and would not likely have guessed for a long time. We didn't know that women's mate preferences changed over the cycle until evolutionary thinking led us to that discovery. So that's one point that I want to make. But we've also seen how evolutionary thinking can clarify and unite diverse parts of the human experience, can help us understand the best and the worst of ourselves, from violence and aggression and infidelity to men's care for their children, sexual attraction, sexual pleasure, and even the strength and fragility of romantic love. Thank you.
Here's a question I'm left with after watching this talk. Think about it and let me know if you have any answers in our class discussion for this week. Now that we are aware of the general trends and patterns in the outcome of sexual selection for both males and females, you may be wondering why patterns seem so reliable across different species. Now that we are aware of the general trends and patterns in the outcome of sexual selection for both males and females, you may be wondering why patterns seem so reliable across different species. The fact that males, for the most part, do the fighting and/or showing off, while females are responsible for choosing amongst different potential mates, can be explained by looking closely at differences in reproductive anatomy. Most animals, including humans, are anisogamous, meaning that they produce offspring through the union of two differently sized sex cells. Male sex cells, also known as sperm, are what biologists call cheap and abundant. Before all of you sperm producers take offense, let me explain what I mean using humans as an example. Human males begin producing sperm at about age 12 and are able to do so continuously until their 80s and possibly later. Millions of new sperm are made each day. Contrast that with human females, who produce eggs, the more scarce and expensive reproductive cells. A human female is born with 1 to 2 million eggs, and that is all of the eggs she will ever have. By age 12, that number of eggs has already plummeted to about 25% of its original size, leaving a woman with about 300,000 eggs. As she ages, this supply of eggs will steadily decline. By menopause, which generally occurs in women between 40 and 50 years of age, women are unlikely to have any eggs left. Over the course of a woman's lifetime, only about 3 to 500 of these eggs will reach maturity, or a state at which they could be fertilized by sperm. The process of an egg maturing, aka the menstrual cycle, as many human females can assure you, can be painful, cause anemia, depression, intestinal distress, and other unpleasant side effects. Eggs require more metabolic effort to produce than sperm, largely because they provide the cellular environment for the development of the embryo during pregnancy. After pregnancy, human females feed offspring with breast milk. Maternal fuel metabolism jumps up after childbirth, with a 15 to 25% increase in energy expenditure for milk production. For women who give their babies breast milk only, an additional 400 to 500 kilocalories per 24 hours is required for milk production during the first 6 months after delivery. It is for all of these reasons that we can understand why females have a greater level of investment in the reproductive process and benefit from choosing a mating partner wisely. Males are limited by females, so their objective is to fight hard for the opportunity to mate. Note that I am not referring to humans specifically here, but mammals in general and primates in particular.